Dirt crudted the rim of his beaten tin cup, tasting mostly of ash and dead pine needles. He spat a mouthful of bitter grounds onto the snow. Down below, the settlement looked like scattered teeth. Marry her, the sheriff had said, or hang, he wiped his jaw. A miserable choice. The wind up the switchbacks did not howl. It drove like a wedge against the ribs. Hiram led the pack mule by a frayed rope, his heavy boots breaking the crust of the snow. Behind the mule came the gray mare. Sitting atop the mare, wrapped in a coarse woolen blanket, was Abigail. They had been married 4 hours. There was no ceremony to speak of. Just Judge Josiah, standing behind a pine desk in a room that smelled of stale tobacco and wet dog, reading from a book with a cracked leather spine. Hiram had stood in his trapping leathers, smelling of grease and wood smoke. Abigail had stood beside him in a faded brown dress, looking straight ahead. She was 32. In Oakhaven, that made her a spinster, an old maid, a woman invisible, until she became a problem. The problem had started with a late-season blizzard. Hiram had come down from the high country to trade pelts for powder and salt. The storm hit before he could clear the valley. Blinded by whiteout conditions, he had kicked open the door to the nearest structure he could find, Abigail's detached barn. He had holed up with her milking cow for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, the wind died. Abigail had come out to milk the cow and found a mountain man shivering in the straw. She hadn't screamed. She had gone back inside and returned with a tin plate of hot beans and a cup of black coffee. Amos, the neighbor with a penchant for early rising and a nose for other people's business, had seen Hiram walk out of that barn holding the tin plate. In a town governed by a puritanical streak and a bored sheriff, that was enough. A ruined reputation, a compromised woman. Hiram was an outsider, a savage in their eyes. The town formed a quick mob. Sheriff Jebediah gave him the ultimatum in the dirt street. Take responsibility for the stain on the woman's honor, or face a rope over the livery stable rafters. They didn't care about Abigail's honor. Not really. They just wanted an excuse to exert control over a man who lived outside it. Hiram chose the woman. He wasn't ready to die over a plate of beans. Now they were climbing into his world. The air grew thinner, biting the inside of the nostrils, turning the moisture of Hiram's breath to rime on his thick beard. He did not look back to see how she was faring. She fell off. That was his mindset. He was furious. Furious at the town, furious at the neighbor, furious at the silent woman riding his mare. She had lost her small plot of land to the bank months ago anyway. The sheriff had mentioned, laughing. She was a burden passed from Oakhaven to the mountain. The trees changed from scrub oak to towering lodgepole pines. The shadows lengthened, pooling blue and deep across the snow. The cabin sat nestled against a granite outcropping. It was small. Logs chinked with mud and horsehair, a stone chimney smoking faintly from the banked coals inside. No porch, no curtains, just a heavy oak door and a single grease paper window. Hiram stopped the mule. He dropped the rope. He walked to the mare and stood there. Abigail looked down at him. Her face was pale, pinched by the cold, but her dark eyes were steady. She didn't wait for him to offer a hand. She swung her leg over the saddle horn and dropped into the snow. Her knees buckled slightly. It was a long, freezing ride, but she caught herself against the stirrup leather. Hiram grabbed the mare's reins. "Outhouse is back of the wood pile," he said. His voice was gravelly, unused to regular work. "Cabin's open." He led the animals toward the lean-to. He expected her to stand there, waiting for instruction, or perhaps to start weeping now that the reality of her banishment had set in. He took his time unsaddling the mare. He brushed her down with a stiff brush, checking her hooves, delaying the moment he had to go inside and face the stranger in his house. When he finally pushed open the heavy oak door, carrying his saddle and rifle, he stopped in the frame. The cabin was warmer. The fire had been built up, fresh logs snapping and spitting pine pitch against the stones. The kettle was on the iron hook, beginning to steam. Abigail had removed her heavy coat and bonnet. She was sweeping the dirt floor with a bound bundle of pine boughs he used as a broom. She did not look up when he entered. She just kept sweeping, gathering the dirt, the dropped ash, the tracked-in snow. Hiram hung his saddle on a peg. He set his rifle in the corner. He took off his hat. "You don't have to do that," he said. "Floors need sweeping," she replied. Her voice was flat, neutral. He watched her for a moment. He realized then that he knew absolutely nothing about this woman, other than the fact that she made a decent plate of beans and that she didn't waste time on tears. The first 2 weeks were a study in avoidance. The cabin was 12 feet by 16. Moving around each other required a tight choreography of turn shoulders and step-back heels. Hiram operated on routine. A man alone in the high country survives by doing exactly what needs to be done, exactly when it needs doing. He rose in the flat gray light before the sun crested the eastern ridge. He checked the fire. He pulled on his boots. He went out to chop wood, feed the stock, and walk his close trap lines. He expected her to stay in bed or huddle by the fire. She didn't. By the third day, she had found his spare axe. It was a lighter hatchet, meant for kindling, but she put it to work. When Hiram returned with a pair of snared rabbits one afternoon, he found a neat stack of split cedar stacked precisely beside the hearth. They barely spoke. Words were expensive up here, and neither felt flush. One morning, the temperature plummeted. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against the log walls. Hiram woke to the sharp ache in his knuckles that meant a hard freeze. He rolled off his pallet on the floor. He had given her the bed without a word, a silent concession to the bizarre circumstances of their arrangement. He pulled on his coat and headed out. He needed to check a snare line a mile down the ridge, hoping to catch a fox before the deep snow buried the sets. When he returned 2 hours later, the cabin was empty. Panic, sudden and unfamiliar, spiked in his chest. A woman from the valley wouldn't last an hour in this temperature if she wandered off. He dropped the pelts he was carrying and walked quickly toward the lean-to. The mare and mule were there. He looked at the snow, boot tracks, hers. They led away from the cabin, down the steep incline toward the creek. He followed the tracks, his hand instinctively resting on the heavy knife at his belt. As he neared the bottom of the draw, he heard it, the hollow, rhythmic knocking sound. It was the sound of the creek running under thick ice, a sluggish, dark movement beneath a white crust. But over that there was a sharper noise, the thud of metal on ice. He pushed through the frosted willows. Abigail was kneeling on the bank. She had the heavy cast-iron bucket beside her. In her hands was a rusted pry-bar he usually kept in the shed. She was bringing it down on the thick ice, trying to chop a hole to draw water. She was breathing hard, her breath plumbing in the freezing air. She wore his oversized spare coat, the sleeves rolled up. Hiram stepped forward. "You'll break your wrists doing that." She stopped and looked up at him. Her face was flushed from exertion. She didn't say anything. She just raised the bar and brought it down again. A spider web of cracks appeared in the ice. He stepped onto the frozen creek. He reached down and grabbed the bar she held on. For a long second they pulled against each other. Her hands, he noticed, were not soft. They were red with cold, the knuckles rough. "Let go," he said, keeping his voice low. "I can fetch water," she said, her jaw tight. "Ice is 6 inches thick. You don't chop it. You break it with a rock." He didn't pull the bar from her hands. He just held his grip firm until she slowly released her fingers. He walked up the bank, found a heavy, jagged piece of granite, walked back, and dropped it squarely on the spider web of cracks. The ice shattered with a loud crack, exposing the black, rushing water beneath. He kicked the loose chunks away, dipped the heavy iron bucket into the freezing water, and hauled it up. He held the bucket out to her. "It's heavy." She took it. The water sloshed, spilling a few drops onto the snow. Her arms shook slightly from the sudden weight, but she didn't lower it. She turned and began the steep walk back up to the cabin. Hiram watched her back. The oversized coat swallowed her frame, but she walked with a rigid, determined spine. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the heavy door on its iron hinges. After a dinner of salted venison and dry biscuits, Hiram sat by the fire. He pulled his Winchester from its scabbard. He stripped it down. He sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, a rag soaked in linseed oil in his hand. He wiped down the barrel. He checked the lever action. He lifted the stock to his shoulder, looking down the sights at the far wall. The oiled walnut felt heavy and dense, seating perfectly into the familiar hollow of his collarbone. The metallic click of the sear engaging was loud in the quiet room. He lowered the rifle. Abigail was sitting at the small wooden table. She had a needle and thread. Across her lap was his heavy canvas coat, the one he had torn on a jagged branch 3 days prior. She was mending the tear. Her stitches were tight, even methodical. "Don't need to do that," he said. She tied off a knot and bit the thread with her teeth. "A tear lets the wind in. Wind makes you cold. Cold makes you careless." She laid the coat on the table. "I don't need a careless man freezing to death and leaving me up here alone." Hiram stared at her. He set the rifle across his knees. "You'd prefer I take you back down to Oak Haven?" Abigail looked up. Her dark eyes caught the firelight. For the first time, he saw a flash of genuine anger in them. Not at him, at the valley below. "I spent 32 years in Oak Haven," she said quietly. "I washed the dead. I delivered the babies. I sat with the sick. And the moment my father died and the bank took the deed, I became trash in the street." She looked back down at the coat, smoothing the canvas over the repaired seam. "I'll take the cold." She stood up, walked to her side of the room, and pulled the blanket back on the bed. Hiram sat by the fire for a long time after she went to sleep. He listened to the wind outside. He looked at the mended coat on the table. He picked up his rag and went back to oiling the metal of his rifle, turning her words over in his head like smooth stones in a river. The real winter arrived not with a howl, but with a suffocating silence. The sky turned the color of bruised iron. The snow fell in heavy, wet flakes that stuck to the pine needles and weighed the branches down until they snapped under the burden. It snowed for 3 days straight. The drifts piled up to the bottom of the grease paper window. Food became the immediate problem. The traps were buried. The game had hunkered down. They were subsisting on dried meat and a dwindling sack of cornmeal. Hiram knew he had to go higher up the ridge to find elk yards, where the herds gathered and stomped down the snow to reach the dry grass beneath. It would be a long, brutal trek. He would be gone at least 2 days. He packed his gear in the dark. He loaded a canvas sack with hardtack and a small portion of the jerky. He strapped on his snowshoes. Abigail was awake. She was boiling coffee. She poured a tin cup and set it on the table. "I'm heading for the upper basin," Hiram said, slinging his pack over his shoulder. He pointed to a secondary rifle leaning by the door, an old Sharps buffalo rifle, a heavy, single-shot weapon that kicked like a mule. "Keep that loaded. Keep the door barred. If the wood runs low, don't go past the lean-to." "I know how to manage a fire," she said. "I'm not worried about the fire," he said. "The cold makes things hungry. Cougars track down from the high peaks when the snow gets this deep. They get desperate." She looked at the heavy Sharps. "I'll manage." Hiram nodded once. He stepped out into the blue-gray dawn, the snow crunching loudly under his webs. The trek was punishing. The snow was powdery, offering little resistance, making every step a labor. He pushed through the timberline, scanning the white expanse for any sign of movement. By nightfall, he had reached a rocky overhang. He built a small, hidden fire, wrapped himself in his buffalo hide, and slept fitfully. The next morning he found the tracks. Elk, a small group, moving slow. He tracked them for hours, the cold seeping into his bones. He finally spotted a straggling cow elk, weak from the winter. He dropped her with a single clean shot. Butchering in the cold was a bloody, desperate business. He worked fast, quartering the meat, packing what he could carry, and hanging the rest high in a pine tree to retrieve later. The weight on his back was immense, but it was survival. It was life. He started the trek back. He was 2 miles from the cabin when he heard it. The sound carried through the crisp, thin air, a sharp, booming crack. It wasn't the sharp crack of a Winchester. It was a heavy, concussive roar. The Sharps. Hiram froze. His breath caught in his throat. He looked at the sky. It was late afternoon, the light already fading. He dropped the heavy pack of meat in the snow. He didn't care about it anymore. He started to run. Running in snowshoes is an awkward, agonizing gait. His lungs burned. His thighs screamed with lactic acid. He pushed through the deep drifts, his eyes fixed on the tree line ahead where the cabin sat. He didn't know what he expected to find. A raiding party from down below? A drifter? He broke through the last stand of lodgepoles. The cabin was intact, the door was closed, but out by the lean-to, the snow was torn up. Hiram unslung his Winchester and racked the lever as he sprinted the last 50 yards. He rounded the corner of the lean-to, his rifle raised. He stopped dead. The snow was sprayed with a brilliant, stark crimson. Lying in the center of the bloody patch was a mountain lion. It was a massive, gaunt male, its ribs showing through its tawny coat. Its head was a ruin of bone and fur. Standing 10 feet away was Abigail. She held the heavy Sharp rifle in both hands. The barrel was still smoking faintly. She was wearing his spare coat. Her boots sunk deep in the snow. Her face was pale, but she wasn't shaking. Behind the lean-to fence, the mule was stomping its hooves in terror, blowing hard but unhurt. Hiram lowered his rifle. He walked slowly toward her. He looked at the cat. It was a monster, driven mad by hunger. The tracks showed it had been creeping along the roof of the lean-to, preparing to drop onto the mule. "It was on the roof," Abigail said. Her voice was slightly hoarse, but steady. Hiram looked at the roof. The snow was disturbed at the edge. "You saw it?" "I heard the mule kicking." She lowered the rifle, resting the heavy stock in the snow. I came out. It hissed at me, flattened its ears. "You shot it from the hip?" Hiram asked, noting how she held the heavy weapon. I tried to lift it to my shoulder. "It was too heavy," she admitted. "So I braced the stock against my hip bone and pulled the trigger when it tensed to jump." Hiram stared at her. The recoil of a .50 caliber Sharps fired from the hip was enough to fracture a pelvis or throw a grown man on his back. He looked at her hip. She was standing slightly crooked, favoring her left leg, but she was standing. He looked back down at the dead predator. The shot had hit it square in the chest, traveling up through the neck and head. Devastating. Precise. "You saved the mule," he said quietly. "I wasn't going to take our transport," she replied. "Our transport." The word hung in the freezing air between them. Hiram reached down and drew his skinning knife. He looked at the cat. The pelt was ragged but usable. The meat was stringy, but it was meat. "Go inside," he said. "Check your hip. Put some snow on it if it's swelling. I'll take care of this." "No," Abigail said. Hiram paused, looking up at her. "It's a big animal," she said. "You're tired. I can hold the legs." For a long moment, the mountain man and the old maid looked at each other over the bloody carcass of the mountain lion. The silence of the high country pressed in on them, but it no longer felt empty. It felt thick with a sudden, unspoken understanding. The town of Oak Haven had sent him a burden. They had thought they were punishing him. They had been wrong. Hiram nodded slowly. He handed her the heavy rifle. She took it, leaned it against the log wall, and walked back over to the carcass. She knelt in the blood-stained snow, grabbed the heavy hind legs of the cat, and looked at him, waiting. Hiram knelt beside her, placed the edge of his blade against the cat's belly, and went to work. These stories only live when someone is there to listen. If this one struck a chord, pull up a chair. Like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep the fire burning together. Share it with someone who knows that the best tales are not always pretty. Leave a comment with your thoughts on what happens next. The wind is howling out there, but we have plenty of wood left. Let us finish this long story together tomorrow. Winter did not surrender all at once. It fought a brutal, grinding retreat. The first sign of the break was the sound, the deep, concussive groaning of the ice on the high ridge giving way, fracturing under the creeping warmth of the sun. The snow turned from powder to a dense gray slush that soaked through leather and froze solid again at nightfall. In the cabin, the rhythm of survival had shifted. They were no longer two strangers navigating a cramped box. They moved around each other with the silent, unconscious efficiency of gears in a watch. When Hiram returned from the trap lines, Abigail already had the skinning gambrel hung. When Abigail hauled water, Hiram automatically took the heavy bucket at the door without breaking his stride. The shift cemented itself during the fall spring of late February. Hiram had been fleshing a beaver pelt. The knife caught a knot of gristle, skipped, and laid open the fleshy part of his left palm. He washed it in the snow, bound it tight with a strip of linen, and ignored it. In the high country, you didn't stop working for a cut. 3 days later, he couldn't close his hand. He woke in the dark, shivering violently, his teeth clicking together with a sound like dry bones. The cabin was freezing, but his skin radiated a dry, suffocating heat. He tried to sit up and failed. The muscles in his back had seized. He looked at his hand in the dim light of the banked coals. It was swollen tight as a drum, red streaks tracking viciously up his forearm toward his elbow. He heard the rustle of the bed frame. Abigail stepped into the weak light. She looked at him, then at his hand. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask how he felt. She walked to the hearth, built up the fire with kindling, and set the kettle on the hook. "Keep your arm elevated," she said. For the next 4 days, Hiram existed in a delirium of fever and pain. The world shrank to the rough wood of the floor boards and the smell of boiling water. He remembered the sharp, blinding agony of a blade lancing the infection. He remembered the thick, putrid smell of drawing salve, pine pitch, and crushed charcoal smeared across the wound. He remembered a cold cloth pressing against his burning forehead, repeatedly, tirelessly. Mostly he remembered the sound of the cabin door opening and closing. He drifted in and out, the fever blurring the edges of the days. Once he woke to the smell of fresh blood. The door was propped open. Abigail was dragging a yearling mule deer through the snow toward the lean-to. She had his Winchester slung across her back. She stopped, wiped the sweat from her face with a bloody sleeve, and hauled the carcass out of sight. When the fever finally broke, the cabin was quiet. The fire crackled steadily. Hiram pushed himself up onto his elbows. His hand throbbed, heavily bandaged in clean linen, but the fiery heat in his blood was gone. Abigail was sitting at the table, methodically scraping a fresh hide with a dull blade. "You shot a deer?" His voice was a rasp, raw as sandpaper. She paused the blade. "We were out of meat. The traps were empty. It's a heavy rifle. I braced it on a stump." She went back to scraping, drank the tea in the cup. "It's bitter, but it keeps the fever down." Hiram swung his legs over the pallet. He looked at this woman. The valley fat was gone from her cheeks. Her hands were rough, stained with blood and sap. The faded brown dress she had worn up the mountain was replaced by a rough woolen shirt and canvas trousers she had tailored from his spares. She belonged to the timber now. "I owe you," he said. The words tasted foreign in his mouth. Abigail stopped scraping again. She turned her head and met his gaze. Her dark eyes were hard, unblinking. "You don't owe me anything. We share the work. That's the arrangement." He nodded slowly. He picked up the tin cup and drank the bitter tea. By late April, the runoff had turned the valley trails into a sucking morass of mud. The trapping season was over. The pelts were stretched, scraped, and stacked. Prime winter beaver, fox, marten, and the massive tawny hide of the mountain lion, thick and flawless, except for the heavy stitching at the throat. It was time to trade. They loaded the pack mule in the crisp morning air. The weight of the furs was substantial. It was a year's wages in raw hide, enough for powder, lead, salt, flour, and coffee to last through the next winter. Hiram secured the diamond hitch over the canvas tarp. He looked at Abigail. She was saddling the mare. "You don't have to go down," he said, testing the tension on the rope. "I can make the trade. Be back in 3 days." She tightened the cinch, pulled the stirrup leather straight, and looked over the saddle at him. "I'm going. The flour needs picking, and I don't trust a man to buy the right needles." It was an excuse, and they both knew it. She wasn't going for needles. She was going because she had walked out of Oakhaven a condemned outcast, a piece of trash swept under the rug. She was going back as a partner. The descent was agonizing. The snowmelt had swollen the creeks into raging muddy torrents. The trail was a slick chute of red clay and exposed roots. They rode in silence, the air growing thicker, warmer, losing the sharp ozone bite of the high pines and taking on the heavy, stagnant smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. When the timber finally broke, the settlement of Oakhaven lay below them in the valley floor. It looked exactly the same. Scattered wooden buildings lining a muddy central street. The livery stable, the bank, the mercantile, a place built on dirt and stubbornness. They rode into town just past noon. The street was busy with spring traffic, wagons hauling timber, women walking the boardwalks, men standing in front of the saloon. The noise, the shouting, the rattle of harnesses, the barking dogs, felt chaotic and grating to ears tuned to the wind and the silence of the snow. The reaction was immediate. Conversation died as they passed the livery. A man carrying a sack of feed stopped dead, dropping the sack into the mud. Women on the boardwalk pulled their shawls tighter and stared. They had expected Hiram to be dead. They had certainly expected the spinster to be dead. The mountain in winter did not suffer fools, and it rarely spared the weak. Instead, they saw the mountain man riding tall, a jagged scar visible on his left hand, his Winchester resting easy across his thighs, and, behind him, riding not side saddle, but astride, was Abigail. She wore his canvas coat. A hunting knife rested on her belt. Her face was weathered, hardened by wind and sun. Her eyes scanning the street with a cold, detached indifference. She did not look at the ground. She looked right through them. Hiram pulled up the mule in front of Miller's mercantile. He dismounted. He tied off the mare and the mule. He didn't look at the gathered crowd on the boardwalk. He loosened the tarp on the mule, pulling the heavy stack of furs down. "Wait here," he told, she said. She swung down from the mare. Her boots hit the boardwalk with a heavy, solid thud. She walked past him and pushed open the door to the mercantile. Hiram smiled grimly, hoisted the pelts over his shoulder, and followed her inside. The mercantile smelled of kerosene, dry goods, and stale peppermint. Miller, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, was standing behind the long wooden counter. He looked up as the bell above the door jingled. The color drained from his face. "Good Lord," Miller breathed. "Abigail?" She walked to the counter, pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket, and laid it flat on the glass display case. "I have a list, Mr. Miller. 50 pounds of flour, unbleached. 20 pounds of salt, 10 of coffee. And I want the good beans, not the sweepings from the bottom of the barrel." Hiram walked in, dropping the heavy bundle of pelts onto the wooden floor with a thick slap. The impact sent a cloud of dust into the slanting sunlight. Miller tore his eyes from Abigail to the furs, his merchant's instinct fighting through his shock. He walked around the counter, pulling out his pocket knife. He cut the twine. The pelt spilled open. His eyes went wide. The quality was exceptional. The beaver was thick, the marten flawless. And then he saw the mountain lion. He ran his hand over the dense, tawny fur. This is prime winter cat. Massive. It'll cover the list," Hiram said, resting his hand on the counter. "Plus a new axe head, 3 tins of powder, and 50 feet of hemp rope. You calculate the rest in hard currency." Miller swallowed hard. "I can do that, Hiram." "Yes." But he looked nervously toward the window. The bell above the door jingled again. The doorway was blocked by 3 men. Sheriff Jebediah stood in the center, a heavy brass star pinned to his canvas vest. Behind him were 2 deputies, Calvin and a thick-necked man named Stokes. Jebediah stepped into the store. The heavy spurs on his boots dragged across the floorboards. He looked at Hiram. He looked at Abigail. A muscle feathered in his jaw. This was an affront to his authority. He had sent them up there to vanish. Their survival was a direct insult. "Well," Jebediah said, his voice a slow drawl. "Look what the spring wash brought down." Hiram didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Miller. "Weigh the flour, Miller." "Hold on now." Jebediah stepped closer. He looked down at the pile of furs. Greed flared in his eyes. That pile was worth $200 in Denver. "You've been trapping town land, mountain man." Hiram turned slowly. "I trapped the high basin. That's federal land. Not yours." "Border's muddy," Jebediah lied smoothly. "Town council passed an ordinance over the winter. Tax on all pelts taken from the county watershed. Looks to me like you owe about half that pile. It was a blatant theft. An extortion attempt fueled by wounded pride and greed. I don't pay town taxes," Hiram said, his voice dropping an octave, the gravel in it hardening to stone. "I don't live in your town." "You do when you stand in it," Jebediah sneered. He nodded to his deputies. "Confiscate the furs, boys. We'll hold them in the jail until the judge can assess the fine." Calvin stepped forward, reaching for the mountain lion pelt. Violence in the wild is not a slow build. It is instantaneous. Hiram didn't argue. He shifted his weight, pivoted, and drove his right fist directly into Calvin's throat. The crack of cartilage was sickeningly loud. Calvin dropped like a stone, clutching his neck, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Stokes lunged. Hiram caught the man's wrist, twisted savagely, and drove a knee into his ribs. But Jebediah was a survivor too. He didn't fight fair. As Hiram broke Stokes's ribs, the sheriff unholstered his heavy Colt revolver and brought the iron barrel down hard on the back of Hiram's skull. The sound was a dull, heavy thud. Hiram collapsed, hitting the floorboards face first. Blood instantly pooled around his hair. "Drag him out," Jebediah barked, breathing hard, risking the law, assaulting a deputy. "I'm going to hang him from the livery right now." Stokes, wheezing in pain, grabbed Hiram by the boots and dragged him backward out the door. His head bounced on the threshold. Abigail stood perfectly still at the counter. Miller had backed himself against the shelves, trembling. Jebediah looked at her, adjusting his hat. "Should have stayed on the mountain." "Abigail, he's dead. I'll see to it you get a room at the boarding house. You can go back to washing the sick." He turned and walked out. Abigail looked down at the blood on the floorboards. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out for mercy. She turned, walked out the back door of the Mercantile, and stepped into the alley. She walked around to the front street. A crowd had gathered. Stokes and Jebediah were hauling the half-conscious Hiram toward the livery stable. The townsfolk watched in silence. No one intervened. This was Oakhaven. Abigail bypassed the crowd. She walked directly to the pack mule. She reached under the canvas tarp. Her fingers closed around the cold, heavy barrel of the Sharp's buffalo rifle. She drew it out. The weapon was nearly 4 feet long, weighing 14 pounds. It was a siege engine, not a hunting rifle. She checked the breech. A massive brass cartridge the size of a man's thumb sat in the chamber. She snapped at the breech closed. She stepped off the boardwalk into the deep mud of the street. "Jebediah," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmuring crowd like a straight razor. The sheriff stopped. He turned around, his hand resting on his holstered Colt. When he saw her standing there, holding the massive rifle, he laughed. A short, barking sound. "Put that cannon down, Abigail, before you break your shoulder," he called out. Abigail didn't speak. She didn't brace the rifle on her hip this time. She hoisted the heavy stock, locking it tight into the pocket of her shoulder. She planted her boots in the mud. She aligned the heavy iron sights. She cocked the hammer. The double click echoed off the wooden storefronts. "I said, put it down," Jebediah warned, his hand drawing the Colt halfway. Abigail pulled the trigger. The explosion tore the air apart. A spout of white smoke erupted from the muzzle, smelling sharply of sulfur. The recoil threw her upper body back, but her boots held the mud. The .50 caliber slug did not hit the sheriff. It hit the thick wooden hitching post, standing 3 inches to his right. The post exploded into a shower of lethal wooden shrapnel. A jagged splinter the size of a railroad spike embedded itself into Jebediah's thigh. He screamed, dropping his revolver into the mud, falling backward and clutching his leg. The crowd shrieked and scattered, diving behind troughs and barrels. Stokes froze, dropping Hiram's boots. Abigail lowered the rifle from her shoulder. The ringing in the street was absolute. She reached into her pocket, pulled a fresh brass cartridge, cracked the breech, and slid it home. She snapped it shut and cocked the hammer again. She walked forward. The mud sucked at her boots, but she moved with deliberate, terrifying purpose. She stopped 10 feet from the bleeding sheriff. Amos, the neighbor who had ruined her, was cowering behind a water barrel. She looked right at him, then back to Jebediah. "He is my husband," Abigail said. The silence in the street was so profound that her normal speaking voice reached everyone. "By your law, Sheriff. You made the arrangement." Jebediah was panting, clutching his bleeding leg. "You're crazy." "No," she said, raising the heavy barrel, pointing it directly at the center of his chest. "I'm just done washing your dead. If you touch him again, if anyone from this valley steps foot past the timberline, I will come back down here and I will not miss the post." She didn't yell. There was no hysteria in her voice. It was a cold, absolute statement of fact, backed by a smoking gun and eyes that had seen the brutal truth of winter. She looked at Stokes. "Pick him up." Stokes, terrified, grabbed Hiram under the arms and hauled him to his feet. Hiram swayed, blood running down the side of his face. He blinked, shaking the cobwebs from his brain, and looked at Abigail. He saw the smoking rifle. He saw the bleeding sheriff. He spat a mouthful of blood into the mud. He walked past Stokes, walked up to Abigail, and placed a hand over the receiver of the rifle, while gently pushing the barrel down. "It's over," he said quietly. He looked at Miller, who was standing trembling on the porch of the Mercantile. "Load the mule, Miller. We'll wait." 20 minutes later, the pack mule was loaded with flour, salt, coffee powder, and rope. The crowd remained hidden. Jebediah had been dragged to the doctor's office. Hiram mounted the mare. Abigail swung up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. They didn't look back as they rode out of Oakhaven. They hit the timberline just as the sun began to drop, casting long blue shadows across the trail. The air instantly cooled, smelling of pine and clean snowmelt. Hiram reached down and rested his hand over hers where it clasped his waist. Her hand was rough, calloused, and perfectly steady. They rode up the mountain, leaving the valley and its judgment far below, bound together by blood, cordite, and the unforgiving high country that was now entirely theirs. Stories like this only matter if someone is listening. If you felt the cold of that mountain, pull up a chair. Like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep the fire burning. Share it with someone who knows real strength isn't always loud. Leave a comment with your thoughts on Abigail's choice. The wind is always howling somewhere, but we have plenty of wood left. Come, let us gather and finish the next tale together tomorrow.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, they forced the mountain man to marry the old maid. What she did next shook the whole county. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me was how easily people can be defined by labels before anyone takes the time to see who they really are. This story carries a simple lesson about looking beyond reputation, age, and expectations, and allowing someone's character to speak for itself. Have you ever underestimated someone and later changed your mind? How would you handle being judged before people truly knew you? Maybe we can all listen a little more and assume a little less in our own lives. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these mountain man stories, feel free to like and subscribe.